Let's look at one of the coolest new features of Lightroom 3, lens corrections. Here's a shot I took of Tim Gray with a fisheye lens. There's obvious distortion. Let's come over here in the right panel, select Lens Corrections, and I'm going to start off by selecting Enable Profile Corrections. This works automatically, and Lightroom finds the name of the manufacturer here, Nikon, the model of the lens. This is the DX fisheye, and it finds this information by looking at the EXIF data attached to the image file, and this is the profile that's been created that will specifically work with that lens. If I want, I can go down here and choose either distortion, chromatic aberration, or vignetting sliders to either boost or decrease the amount of corrections that are taking place. In this case here, let me move the distortion slider over to the right, and you can see now that's not helping, and we don't need to boost it that way. We're going to go back this way, and this is actually pretty much turning it off. So we're back to our original fisheye distortion. And these sliders below, the chromatic aberration, the vignetting, work in similar fashion. This is just boosting the automatic effect that was applied with the particular profile that works with this lens. If I'm not happy with what I'm finding here, I can also go over and select Manual right there, and I can now manually set some of the parameters for the lens correction. In this case, I'll go ahead and I'm going to just slide this down a little bit. I'm using the grid that appears as some kind of reference point for my transformation. I'll go about to there, and I can use the vertical slider now. I'm definitely going to use the grid to line up the pillars there to the grid just to get that straightened out. All right, that's pretty good. Now, in terms of scale, it's automatically cropped my image. I want to get more of the picture original back in, so I'm going to move the scale down, maybe not that far, up a little bit there, so farther back there. And now if I select Constrain Crop, it's going to go ahead and crop out the areas that were missing the image. I can go back up to the crop overlay tool at any point and further tweak that crop using that tool the whole time having the lens correction pane open. There's one other thing I can work on over here, and that's lens vignetting. I can decrease that amount, and you can see it darkens on the edges, and I can increase it. And actually that's too much. Let me just bring that about to there. Okay, so using a combination of a profile and manual settings, so you can see in a side-by-side comparison that we've really fixed that distorted image. Okay, let's pick another example. That one was pretty obvious, the fisheye distortion. Let me pick one that doesn't have much distortion. This was shot with, I'll know by selecting Enable Profile Corrections, it'll show me here. This was shot with a Nikon 70 to 200 millimeter lens. Normally the distortion is not as apparent. In this case here, I'm going to show you what has been fixed by turning off the lens correction right here with this little switch. So you can see that the edges, in this case, this is now the fixed image and this is the original. Look at the edges. It's done a lot to fix the vignetting that occurs with the longer lens that I'm using, which is fairly common with the longer lenses. There's not that much of the other distortions or chromatic aberrations. If I like that vignetting, I can come back and bring it back to where it was by moving that slider to 0. I would probably come in and use my effects slider here, and because I actually like the vignetting effect, do that. But that's not what we're talking about now. We're really talking about just the lens corrections themselves, bringing it to a neutral place, and that's what this is doing right now. Let's take another image here. Sometimes you'll select an image, you'll enable profile corrections, as I've done here, and nothing will show up. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's no profile. We just need to manually put the information in. As soon as I put in Nikon, it did find, no, that's not the right lens. So I'm looking through the list of lenses it's suggesting. It was actually this lens here, the 18 to 200 that was used. So I'll select that. Sometimes you need to kind of manually override the lens profile settings. and to get the right setting. Obviously, there are so many lenses and so many lens camera combinations that Adobe hasn't made profiles for everyone. The Nikon lenses are pretty well represented, and certainly the Sigma lenses are. But that doesn't mean that just because your lens does not show up in this list here that you can't create a lens profile on your own. And in fact, Adobe now is offering this neat new tool, the Adobe Lens Profile Creator. And this is free. It's a download from the Adobe site. And with this tool, Adobe provides several targets that you photograph using your lens camera combination. And then you put those shots into the Lens Profile Creator. And this then will calculate and make a very specific customized profile to that lens camera combination. And then you load that into Lightroom. All the instructions are included here with the application that's downloaded from the Adobe website. It's actually very straightforward and pretty easy to use. And then you can create very specific profiles and use those in Lightroom. They will show up. Let me go back over to Lightroom. Once you've loaded them into Lightroom, they'll show up here in the pop-up menu. So that's something that keep in mind if you have lenses that aren't showing up here when you select Enable Profile Corrections, that you can make your own. Let me show you another example. Let's open this picture here. This is nothing wrong with the lens per se, but it's just the perspective, the way the picture was shot. And I can go in and select Manual, and I can work on the vertical slider here. And I'm lining up my grid, which is showing up as I click on the slider. And I'm going to line up one of the grid lines to one of the pillars there. And you can see how now I've completely changed the vertical perspective. I actually used the tilt shift lens, very fancy, expensive lens to make this photograph. Now there's a lot of areas here. All this gray area is lost. So I'm going to once again select Constrain Crop, and it will crop out the areas that the image is no longer there. And again, if you want to tweak that crop yourself, select the crop tool, and you can see there, I can go ahead and fine tune it right in there in the crop overlay tool. And there you go. One last thing I want to address here with the lens corrections is the question of what happens with localized corrections. Let me show you what I mean here. I'm going to select the adjustment brush, and let's just make some kind of exposure change. I'll make it pretty radical so we can see what's going on. So this will darken that area. Now, obviously, if I'm going to distort this picture, the localized correction, in this case with the adjustment brush, better be reflected. So let me deselect that, and I'll come back over. And I'm just using this as an example to show you how Lightroom will compensate when it uses its transform. I'm just using this to show how Lightroom does adapt to the localized settings. You can see here, it's actually taking a lot of processing power to do this, so it's moving a little bit slower, but it does adjust accordingly. So your localized corrections are taken into account when these distortions are applied. And like everything else in Lightroom, this is all non-destructive. At any point, I can click on the reset button or step backwards and go back to my original image. Nothing has been changed in the actual pixels. This is all done within Lightroom and non-destructively. So you can play around with these settings, get to know them a little bit better, and not worry about messing up your original image at all. And I do suggest that you do that, especially with the manual settings. You can really kind of go to town here and have a lot of fun with those settings, or just use them very conservatively to get the picture that you should have had in the first place if your lens hadn't had distortions. So this is just a powerful new tool in Lightroom 3. And again, you can go the simple method where you just simply let Lightroom do the work using a profile that is either already comes with Lightroom or you've built your own, or you can manually fix the images yourself. Just a great new tool in Lightroom 3.